I took my late wife's broken e-reader to a repair shop in Portland. The technician stared at the screen for a few seconds, then suddenly locked the door. His voice trailed off almost a whisper. "Sir, you shouldn't let anyone else see what's inside this device." I frowned, completely bewildered. "What are you talking about?" He pushed the device across the counter, his eyes tense. "You need to listen to the last recording your wife left behind." I pressed play, and I discovered a truth that made my blood run cold with shock. Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Before we continue the mysterious recording, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Note, this is a fictional story. Some details are dramatized to enhance storytelling and offer thoughtful, meaningful reflections. Any similarities to real people or places are purely coincidental. The smell of burnt solder and ozone always made my skin crawl, but today the static in the air felt like a warning from the grave. I sat on a stool that creaked under my weight, feeling the grit of the repair shop floor beneath my boots. I am Thane Garrison, a 70-year-old retired hazelnut farmer with hands calloused by 4 decades in the Oregon soil, and I was currently clutching my late wife's e-reader like a sacred relic. The glass was spiderwebbed with cracks, a jagged map of the moment everything fell apart. Most people would see a broken tablet and think of the cost of a replacement. But I only saw the last thing Jessica was holding when she collapsed on our kitchen floor. My children thought I wanted it fixed so I could finish the historical novels she loved. But that was a convenient lie. I brought the device to Portland because I noticed her fingers were fused to it in her final moments, as if she were trying to protect a secret from the very air she was losing. 2 months of silence had passed in our farmhouse, and the weight of that silence had become a physical burden I could no longer carry without answers. Corbin Mercer, a 30-year-old electronics technician with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous twitch, emerged from the back room looking visibly shaken. He didn't hand the device over to me across the cluttered counter. Instead, he scanned the storefront for other customers before leaning in close. His pencil was doing a jittery tapping dance against his clipboard, a sharp, rhythmic sound that grated on my nerves. I asked him if there was a problem with the billing, my voice sounding older and more tired than I cared to admit. Click. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home as Corbin locked the front door felt like a guillotine dropping. He beckoned me into the back room of his shop, away from the storefront cameras, into a cramped space that smelled of old dust and hot plastic. I followed him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had lived through 70 years of Oregon winters, but the chill I felt now had nothing to do with the weather. He sat me down in front of a terminal where the blue hum of a diagnostic monitor washed over us like a ghost. Corbin plugged the e-reader into the machine, his fingers trembling as he navigated through layers of code that looked like nonsense to a man who spent his life studying soil, pH, and harvest yields. He told me that the storage wasn't filled with the novels I expected to see. Instead, the memory was packed with encrypted high-bitrate audio recordings disguised as mundane system logs. How could a woman who barely knew how to text hide a digital paper trail this deep? I stared at the screen, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. These were hidden intentionally. Corbin whispered, his eyes darting toward the door we had just locked. This wasn't a glitch or a collection of audiobooks. These were timestamps, and every single one of them matched the final week of my wife's life. He admitted that he had almost wiped the drive as part of the standard repair until he saw the file names. My curiosity was no longer a quiet ache. It was a visceral, screaming need to know what Jessica was so afraid of. Corbin's finger hovered over the play button on the diagnostic screen, his voice trembling as he whispered that I needed to hear how this starts. The sound of static breaking into a familiar shaky voice sent a tremor through my soul. Hearing Jessica's voice wasn't like a comforting memory. It was like a cold hand reaching out of the Oregon mist to grab me by the throat. I stood frozen in that cramped back room, the blue light of the diagnostic monitor casting long, sickly shadows across the cluttered workbench. The recording was grainy, a whispered confession captured in the dead of night. Thane, she said, and my name sounded like a prayer and a warning all at once. If you are hearing this, the blue ones aren't mine. I have to hide the real medicine because someone is swapping my bottles. I felt the air leave my lungs. This wasn't just a digital diary of a grieving woman. It was a desperate breadcrumb trail left by a wife who knew her sanctuary had been breached. Corbin Mercer immediately cut the audio before the sentence could even settle in the air. He looked at the door he had just deadbolted, his face pale under the fluorescent hum of the shop lights. He told me he couldn't let me listen to the rest there, that it was far too dangerous for both of us if someone was watching. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I looked at the e-reader, realizing it was no longer a relic, but a ticking bomb. Have you ever felt the ground vanish beneath your feet while you are still standing? That was the moment I realized my home was no longer a sanctuary, and the people I called my own might be the very wolves I had let through the gate. Corbin didn't ask for payment. Instead, he slid a pair of high-end, noise-canceling headphones across the scarred table, his eyes darting toward the security feed. He warned me that as long as I stayed within the standard reading interface, the files remained invisible. But if someone with his skills went looking, I would be in trouble. He leaned in, his voice barely a breath, telling me not to trust my family, not a single one of them, until I had heard the end of that file. I tucked the device deep into the pocket of my wool coat, its weight feeling like a lead sinker pulling me down. I walked out into the freezing rain, the icy water soaking through my clothes, as I climbed into my old truck. The smell of wet asphalt and pine filled the cab, but it did nothing to clear my head. I pulled onto Highway 99 West, the rhythmic, frantic slapping of the windshield wipers struggling against the torrential downpour. The rain didn't just fall. It attacked the windshield like 1,000 tiny needles trying to wash away the sins of my own bloodline. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, my mind racing back to the night Jessica died. I remembered my children hovering over her bedside, their faces masks of concern. I asked myself who was really in the room that night and why I had been so blind. As I slowed the truck, I looked down at the e-reader on the passenger seat. In the dim light of the dashboard, I noticed the spider-webbed cracks on the glass again. They didn't radiate from a single point of impact like a fall would cause. It looked intentional, as if someone had tried to crush the life out of the device under the heel of a heavy boot. As the farmhouse finally came into view through the gray curtain of the storm, I saw a familiar silhouette standing on my porch, waiting in the dark. The headlights of my truck cut through the gloom, illuminating a figure I wasn't prepared to see. I killed the engine, but the silence that rushed in was louder than the storm, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of a porch swing that shouldn't have been moving. My hand drifted to the pocket where the e-reader lay, its jagged screen a cold weight against my thigh. I stepped out into the mud, the freezing rain soaking my wool coat instantly, and realized it was just Pete Miller, my 80-year-old neighbor, who had farmed the plot next to mine since we were both boys. He looked spooked, his yellow rain slicker gleaming under the flickering porch light. "Thane," he said, his voice barely rising above the wind, "you ought to lock your gates. Those men in the black SUV, they weren't looking for hazelnuts." I felt the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp against the roof of my mouth. Pete told me he had seen Silas, my own son, snooping around the property while I was in the city talking to men who looked like they'd never stepped in dirt in their lives. He handed me a damp envelope he'd found stuffed in the mailbox before shuffling back toward his own truck. I hurried him away, my paranoia blooming like a dark flower, and locked the front door with a trembling hand. I retreated to the kitchen, the only room that still smelled faintly of Jessica's lavender and lemon zest. The rhythmic thumping of the storm against the farmhouse felt like a giant's fist trying to get in. I sat at the oak table under a yellowed, flickering bulb and put on the noise-canceling headphones Corbin had given me. I selected File 1 titled The Blue Supplement. Jessica's voice filled my head, and for a second the grief was so physical I nearly doubled over. But her voice was steady, clinical, even as she detailed a trip she'd taken to a pharmacy in McMinnville, 2 towns over. She explained that she had taken the vitamins Silas had been bringing her to a professional for testing. Bang! A shutter blew loose outside, sounding like a gunshot in the hollow house. I jumped, my heart clawing at my ribs, before the recording pulled me back down. Jessica said the pharmacist told her it wasn't a vitamin at all. It was warfarin, a blood thinner administered at 5 times the dose for a woman her size. The clinical cold memory of that pharmacist's verdict echoed in my ears through her retelling. My wife described the physical toll it had taken, the purple bruising on her forearms she'd hidden under long sleeves, and the constant metallic taste that had ruined every meal I'd cooked for her. Jessica's voice was a ghost bridge, the only thing keeping me from drowning in the black ink of my own despair, as she explained why she'd stayed silent. She was terrified I would confront Silas and get hurt. She ended the file by telling me she had hidden the pharmacy receipt in the hollow of the old oak we called the wedding tree. But then her tone shifted to something even more urgent. She revealed that the pharmacy test wasn't her only proof. She had been secretly filming the kitchen for weeks with a hidden camera I never knew existed. As Jessica's voice faded out, she whispered one final sentence that turned my blood to ice. Check the stove, Thane. They've already started the next stage. I ripped the headphones off my gaze, snapping toward the kitchen range, a cold sweat breaking across my brow. I didn't just walk toward the kitchen range. I lunged, my hand trembling as I reached for the dials that should have been cold. The air in the kitchen was thick with the faint, rotten egg smell of natural gas, a scent that shouldn't have been there since I'd finished my tea hours ago. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I found the rear burner valve wide open, though no blue flame flickered. I twisted the dial shut, the silence of the house suddenly becoming predatory. It wasn't just a simple mistake. As I leaned closer, I discovered that a linen dish towel had been placed dangerously close to the pilot light, a deliberate attempt at arson disguised as senility. Someone had been in my house while I was at the repair shop, moving through my life with the clinical precision of a butcher. I threw open the kitchen window, letting the cold, damp November air rush in to clear the poison from the room. "You tried to burn the evidence, didn't you, Silas?" I whispered to the empty room. "Not tonight. Not on my watch." I stood there in the dark, my mind sharpening with a terrifying clarity that only comes when you realize the people you loved have become your executioners. At dawn, the headlights of a luxury SUV swept across the kitchen walls, cutting through the morning mist like searchlights. Silas Garrison, my 45-year-old eldest son, who had long ago traded farm work for the hollow promises of Silicon Forest startups, stood in the kitchen doorway looking at me with a practiced, pitying concern. Behind him was Leon Ross, a 42-year-old hedge fund manager whose designer heels clicked sharply against the farmhouse hardwood. She entered the room with a smile that never quite reached her cold amber eyes. Thud. Silas slammed a box of voodoo donuts onto the counter, a sound like a gavel in the silence. The cloying, sugary scent of glazed donuts immediately fought with the lingering trace of gas. Silas stepped toward me, his voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that made my skin crawl. He told me they were so worried after I didn't answer my phone last night. But I saw his eyes immediately dart toward the stove, checking for the results of his handiwork. "Good morning, Thane," Leon chirped, her voice as sharp as her jewelry. "You smell a bit like gas, dear. Are you sure you're feeling all right? How do you fight an enemy that smiles while they're digging your professional grave?" I sat at the kitchen table feeling trapped in my own home. Leone accidentally found a charred cloth near the stove that I knew wasn't there minutes ago. She sighed with a practiced clinical sympathy, exchanging a dark look with my son. "Silas, look at this," she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. The burner was left on again. My son leaned in, his forehead slick with sweat despite the morning chill. He told me they couldn't keep living in fear that the house would go up in flames while I was sleeping. I watched them work in tandem, a perfectly choreographed performance of concern designed to strip me of my land and my life. Leon reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a glossy brochure for Riverside, her voice dropping to a whisper. Thane, we've already paid the deposit. It's for your own safety. She revealed she had already made an appointment with a specialist for me, and it was scheduled for that very afternoon. I looked from the brochure to Silas's sweating forehead, realizing that the only way to beat a shark is to make it think you're already bait. I stared at the glossy photos of smiling seniors in the brochure, making my hands tremble just enough to satisfy the two predators sitting at my breakfast table. The slick chemical texture of the paper felt like a warning against my skin, but I kept my gaze down, projecting a hollowed-out version of myself. I put on the performance of a lifetime feigning confusion as I traced a finger over the image of a manicured courtyard. "Is this near the farm, Leon?" I asked, my voice thin and cracking at the edges. "My hazelnuts will be ready soon, and I need to be here for the harvest." "It's nearby, Thane," she cooed, her cloying perfume hanging in the air like a heavy shroud. "But you don't need to worry about the trees anymore. Silas will handle that burden for you." I watched her body language from beneath my brow. She leaned in with a predatory grace, describing the amenities of the lockdown facility as if she were pitching a luxury spa. In reality, she was describing my prison cell, a place where doors only opened with a code I wouldn't be given. Silas nodded along his eyes, darting toward the hallway where I'd left my coat earlier. Screech. Leon's chair scraped against the floor, a sound that felt like a knife on bone, signaling a shift in the air. Thinking they had successfully broken my spirit, the two of them began talking as if I had already faded into the wallpaper. They discussed the neighboring interests, and my ears caught the sharp mention of a state permit deadline for the energy company. Silas whispered about the land title, insisting they needed the power of attorney signed today to close the deal by Friday. I learned then that Leon wasn't just aiming for a quick sale of my life. She had a side deal with the drilling company to bypass environmental checks once I was declared legally incompetent. "He's too tired to fight us, Silas," she murmured, her voice stripped of its fake warmth. "Just look at him." Their kindness was a velvet shroud, soft to the touch, but designed to suffocate every right I had to this soil. As they prepared to leave, Silas made a show of helping me tidy the kitchen, but I saw his hand dip into the small ceramic bowl by the door. I heard the faint rattle of the brass key to the external storage shed as it disappeared into his pocket. "We'll see you tomorrow, Dad," he said, patting my shoulder with a hand that felt leaden. "Rest up. You look confused." I forced a vacant smile, whispering that I'd be right here and that I wasn't going anywhere. Once their SUV crunched over the driveway gravel and disappeared from view, the mask dropped. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline as I raced toward the study to verify my defenses. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk where I'd tucked my documents, only to find a hollow sound echoing in the empty space. My passport was gone, stolen by my own son, to ensure I couldn't flee before the Monday admission. My breath hitched as I realized the theft went deeper. I reached behind the loose panel where I'd hidden the e-reader, but my fingers met nothing but cold, empty air. I didn't let the panic take me. I took a deep breath, scanning the room for the one thing they couldn't have known I possessed. My fingers clawed at the underside of the desk, meeting only cold, empty air where the device, my only connection to Jessica's truth, should have been. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull thud in the oppressive silence of the study. Then I remembered. I had deliberately left a cheap broken tablet from the junk drawer out in plain sight as a decoy. The vultures were too efficient for their own good. They had snatched the shiny glass bait and missed the real e-reader taped securely behind the heavy oak bookshelf. I retrieved the actual device with trembling hands, feeling a small, sharp surge of victory over my own flesh and blood. Silas never did pay attention to the details, always looking for the quickest score. I whispered to the shadows that I still had her, that I was still listening. To ensure no hidden microphones captured my reaction, I retreated to my soundproofed basement workshop. The air down there smelled of damp earth and old grease, a familiar, honest scent that Leon's perfume couldn't reach. I sat at my rough, unfinished cedar workbench, the cold sweat dripping down my spine as I activated File 2. The recording was high quality, likely captured, while Leon and Silas were walking through the hazelnut orchard, unaware that Jessica had left her device in a garden basket nearby. Leonie's voice had a high-pitched metallic whine that set my teeth on edge. She spoke of the fracking potential of my eastern 50 acres, claiming the sale would cover her firm's recent embezzlement scandal. I had to stop the recording. My stomach lurched the taste of Leonie's pastries, turning to ash in my mouth. I leaned over the workbench, the wood grain blurring before my eyes. How much is a father worth in the eyes of a son who only sees dollar signs in a sunset? I forced myself to press play again. Silas sounded pathetic, a small man begging for a larger cut to settle his gambling markers. Leon brushed him off, stating that once the old man was safely at Riverside, they would sign the easement. She noted that the energy company wouldn't care about the incidents that led to my admission. Silas asked if I was really that confused, or if they were just making sure I was. The recording revealed a brutal timeline. They had exactly 5 days until the state's natural gas auction. Leon mentioned that the supplements were just the first phase. Riverside was where they would finish the job by ensuring my heart gave out under the stress of what they called dementia-related agitation. I stared at the concrete wall of the basement, the e-reader's glowing blue light, the only thing visible in the dark. "He's 70, Silas," she said, her voice devoid of any human warmth. "Men his age have strokes every day. It's expected." I sat there in the gloom, realizing my son wasn't just stealing the land I had spent 40 years tending. He was participating in my execution. "I'm not going to be a house that's cleared, Leon," I thought with a cold, murderous resolve. "I'm the one who planted these trees." The file ended with the sound of a third voice entering the conversation. On the recording, a voice I recognized instantly, and one that made the e-reader slip from my numb fingers. The basement was silent, but my mind was screaming. The third voice shouldn't have been there. The voice of my own son was a knife, but the third voice on that recording was the whetstone that sharpened it, the dry, clinical tone of Arthur Vance, our family's longtime financial advisor. For 30 years, I had trusted that man with the fruits of my labor, every harvest and every investment. Now, hearing him discuss the asset liquidation of my life with Leon felt like a physical violation. I sat in the darkness of the workshop replaying those whispered words. They weren't just planning a sale. They were dismantling the structure of my very existence. I realized then that the conspiracy wasn't limited to a rotted branch of my family tree. It was the entire orchard. Fearing the farmhouse was bugged, I didn't dare turn on the lights. I packed a small bag with a few essentials and the precious e-reader, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't risk the front gate cameras. I slipped out through the back, my boots sinking into the familiar hazelnut soil as I navigated the groves in the pre-dawn shadows. "Not you too, Arthur," I whispered to the cold wind. "Not after all we built together." I reached my truck parked hidden near the old barn and began the long, paranoid drive to Portland. I arrived at the 8th floor offices of Alaric Benedict, looking like a man who had crawled out of a shipwreck, the grit of the orchard still clinging to my heels. Alaric Benedict, a 65-year-old attorney with a silver-maned head and a reputation for being the most ethical shark in the Portland legal waters, stood as I entered. He didn't ask questions. He simply ushered me into his sanctuary of old leather and high-end espresso. Silence. The Portland traffic hummed 8 stories below, but in that office the air was as thin as a vacuum as I played the first 3 minutes of File 2. I watched the blood drain from Alaric's face as Leon's sharp voice filled the room. "Alaric," I said, my own voice trembling with suppressed rage, "they aren't waiting for me to die. They're making sure I do." He took a long, slow breath and told me we were going to look at everything Jessica left behind. He pulled up a recent filing from the county clerk's digital portal, something I hadn't even known existed. My eyes burned as I stared at the clinical blue light of his monitor. He showed me a restated will dated only 2 weeks before Jessica's death. The signature was a masterpiece, but I knew it was a lie. How many times had I shaken that boy's hand While he held a forged dagger behind his back, Jessica had developed a slight tremor from her Parkinson's, a detail the forger had missed by making the pen strokes too steady. This document granted Silas immediate power of attorney and ownership of the farm the second I was deemed incapacitated. Alaric's pen scratched against a legal pad, a sound like teeth grinding in the quiet office. He told me the courts didn't know it was a fake yet, but there was more. Silas hadn't just forged a will. He had already used it as collateral to secure a massive bridge loan against the farm's equity. Alaric leaned back, his eyes dark with a new terrifying realization. "Thane," he said, his voice dropping. "If they've already taken the loan, they don't just need you in Riverside. They need you gone before the first payment is due." The implications of Alaric's words hit me harder than the revelation of the forgery itself. The drive back to the Willamette Valley felt like descending into a grave I had helped dig with my own silence. My old truck rattling through the evening fog that clung to the hazelnut trees like a shroud. I arrived home at dusk, and the farmhouse looked like a hollow ribcage against the gray Oregon sky, stripped of the warmth Jessica used to provide. I didn't enter through the kitchen. I couldn't bear to see the stove where they had tried to stage my final lapse into senility. Instead, I bypassed the main floor entirely and retreated to the soundproofed basement workshop. The air down there was thick with the smell of damp concrete and motor oil, a familiar, honest scent that usually offered me peace. Today, it only felt cold. My hands were shaking as I navigated the e-reader's interface, my fingers clumsy against the cold glass. "I'm still here, Jessica," I whispered to the shadows. "I'm still listening. They won't take the land, not while I'm still breathing. Leone isn't just paying for high-end care at Riverside. She's paying Linda, the head nurse, a direct 15% kickback of the fracking millions to facilitate a medical erasure of my very existence." I played File 3, a surreptitious recording of a phone call Leone made from our very porch while I was likely napping. The clinical sharp tone of Linda's voice on the recording made my skin crawl as she haggled over the price of my mind. "I need him" under Linda Leone's voice cut through the static with a chilling lack of emotion. "Heavy sedation for the agitation he'll surely show when the gates close." Thump. A branch hit the basement window, sounding like a hand trying to claw its way into my sanctuary. I nearly dropped the device, my heart hammer striking my ribs. "For 15%, Linda replied, her greed audible even through the low bitrate audio. "I'll make sure he doesn't remember his own name, let alone a hazelnut tree. How much does a human soul weigh when it's being traded for drilling rights in a Portland boardroom?" The audio continued as Leone confirmed the move-in date for Monday morning. She mentioned that the first bridge loan payment was due on the 15th, and she needed me medically incapacitated by then to finalize the deed transfer without a fight. Staring at the gray concrete wall, I realized that Riverside wasn't a nursing home. It was a processing center for my disappearance. Monday was the point of no return. I have spent 70 years building a life tending this soil only to have my own blood treat me like a nuisance to be erased for a ledger entry. In the background of the audio, I heard a rhythmic, repetitive scratching. It was the sound of a pen on paper. I realized with a jolt of horror that Silas was right there with her, practicing my signature over and over again, perfecting the forgery for the final transfer papers. I closed the e-reader, my mind racing through the 3 days I had left to live before the chemical fog claimed me. Suddenly, the silence of the basement was shattered. I heard the heavy, familiar tread of boots on the floorboards directly above my head, a vibration that rattled the tools on my workbench. Someone was in the house. I pressed my back against the cold concrete wall, the e-reader clutched to my chest. As the basement door groaned open and a sliver of light cut through the darkness like a searchlight in a prison yard, the heavy, familiar tread of boots on the floorboards above had been a warning. Now the rhythmic creak of the stairs told me the predator was descending into my sanctuary. I remained motionless, a shadow among shadows, as Silas entered the workshop. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, preferring the narrow yellow beam of a high-powered flashlight that danced over my cedar workbenches and tool racks. I realized then that my son wasn't just checking to see if I was home. He was hunting. "Where did you put it, you old fool?" He muttered, his voice thick with a greedy desperation that made my skin crawl. He tossed a stack of old blueprints aside, clearly searching for the e-reader he thought he'd already secured with Leone. The realization that they knew Jessica had been documenting them and that they were terrified of what she'd left behind crystallized the last of my hesitation into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. Silas eventually kicked a wooden stool in frustration, grumbling that it wouldn't matter what I remembered in 2 more days anyway. As he retreated back up the stairs and the door clicked shut, the silence that returned was different. It was no longer the silence of a victim, but the quiet of a man preparing for a long overdue harvest. Have you ever walked into a lion's den? Because it was the only place you could find a spear, I returned to my workbench, the e-reader's blue glow illuminating my calloused hands as I replayed a specific fragment of Jessica's recordings. She had mentioned a master key hidden within Riverside's digital patient logs, evidence of the bribery and the lethal sedation protocols that Linda had used on others. I understood now that I couldn't win this fight by running to Portland again. To get the proof needed for a murder charge, I had to be inside the belly of the beast. You want me in a cage, Silas, fine. But I'm bringing the key with me. I'm coming for you, Linda. I spent the remaining hours of the night in a fever of tactical preparation. I used my finest watchmaking tools to gut an old hearing aid, retrofitting the casing with a high-sensitivity digital recorder. My rage was a whetstone, and I was sharpening myself into a blade they would never see coming. I packed my suitcase with the deliberate clumsiness of the man they wanted me to be mismatched. Wool socks, tattered old photos of the orchard, and a stained cardigan. Hidden in the lining, however, were the tools of my new trade. As the gray, cold light of an Oregon dawn began to bleed through the bedroom window, I stood before the mirror and practiced the vacant, wandering stare of a man whose mind was a sieve. Look at me, Jessica. I'm the best actor this valley has ever seen. Monday is the end of the line for all of us. I picked up the phone, my fingers steady even as I forced my voice to shake with a scripted frailty. I called Silas, and when he answered, I let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. "Son," I said, sounding like a man lost in his own hallway. "I think I'm ready to go to Riverside now." Silas's voice over the phone had been a mixture of surprise and greedy relief when I told him I was ready for Riverside. I hung up the silence of the kitchen pressing in on me, but it didn't last. The phone didn't just ring. It shrieked against the kitchen tile, the caller ID flashing with a name that made my heart stutter, Dr. Breyer Garrison. I stared at the vibrating device, a tightening in my chest, mirroring the gray light of the morning filtering through the window. Breyer was my middle child, a 40-year-old pediatric cardiologist who wore her exhaustion like a second skin. When I answered, her voice was a masterclass in professional distance, the hollow clinical tone she surely used in hospital wards. Dad Silas sent me some concerning notes. She began bypassing any warmth. He mentioned neurological fluctuations and some troubling behavior with the stove. I gripped the edge of the counter, the smell of cold, stale coffee from the morning before rising to meet me. "I'm just tired, Breyer," I said, forcing a weary rasp into my throat. "This big house, it gets quiet." My mind raced as I realized the depth of the trap. Silas hadn't just been gaslighting me. He'd been sending Breyer medical journals and forged logs of my supposed lapses for weeks. He was building a clinical case using my daughter's own expertise to legitimize my incarceration. She started using medical jargon, executive function, cognitive units, neurological decline, that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope rather than a father. How do you tell your own daughter that the brother she grew up with is counting the minutes until his father's heart stops? I had to decide in seconds whether to scream the truth or lead her to it. I chose the latter. Silas is very thorough, isn't he? I mused, letting a bit of bitterness bleed through the act. He always was good at organizing things. Her voice was a scalpel, sharp and sterile, cutting through the memories of the little girl who used to follow me through the orchards. She told me Silas was worried about my safety and that Riverside had a top-tier unit. It was a diagnostic trap set by one sibling and sprung by the other's misplaced sense of duty. I dropped the vacant act just enough to sound lucid, even a bit desperate. "Briar, come to the farm tomorrow morning," I urged. "Just you. No Silas, no Leone. I found something of your mother's, something only you would understand." I could sense her hesitation, the doctor clashing with the daughter, who still remembered the smell of the hazelnut harvests. She went silent for a moment, and I could hear the clinical mask crack as she whispered, "Dad, Silas said you were dangerous." "Are you?" I closed my eyes, the weight of the e-reader in my pocket feeling heavier than the house itself. Briar then admitted something that turned my blood cold. Silas had already asked her to sign a medical affidavit supporting my involuntary commitment. He wanted the legal shackles locked before I even reached the facility gates. "I'll be there, Dad," she finally said, her voice small. "Tomorrow morning." I hung up the phone, my hand shaking, and looked out at the hazelnut trees, knowing I only had 24 hours to prove I wasn't the monster Silas had described. I adjusted my hearing aid, the one that wasn't for hearing at all, as the heavy magnetic locks of Riverside Memory Care clicked behind me with a sound like a prison gate closing on a life sentence. The lobby was sun-drenched and pristine, smelling of lemon bleach and floor wax, an artificial paradise designed to soothe the guilt of the living. Silas stood beside me, his impatient greed radiating off him like heat from a wood stove. We were met by Linda, the 55-year-old head nurse, with a smile as sharp as a scalpel and a voice that sounded like silk rubbing against sandpaper. She performed a saccharine welcome, treating me with the patronizing softness one might use on a 5-year-old. I noticed the contrast immediately between her practiced warmth and the clinical coldness in her eyes. Silas told her that I had been having a lot of spells lately and that it was best to start the stabilization protocol immediately. Linda revealed then that she wasn't just a dedicated nurse. She mentioned her direct financial interest in the drilling company through a shell corporation, effectively making her a primary stakeholder in my disappearance. She spoke of safety protocols that were nothing more than restrictions on my autonomy. I felt the weight of the hidden recorder in my ear, catching every word. Linda led us into the locked memory wing, a world of white walls and the unnerving soft hum of the building's ventilation. The artificial brightness of the fluorescent lights made the hollow, vacant stares of the patients in the hallway look even more tragic. They were staring at nothing, their spirits clearly dampened by chemical restraints. Drip. A patient in the hallway spilled a cup of water, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the sterile silence. My skin crawled as I watched a woman reach out for a hand that wasn't there. Linda openly discussed my agitated nature with Silas, explaining that they use a very specific cocktail for patients with my level of resistance. Silas asked if it was safe, adding that he needed me to be able to sign a few things before I settled in. His voice lacked even a shred of the sun I had raised. How many lives had been traded for dividends in this shiny, carpeted mausoleum? We entered my designated room, a beautiful cage with bolted-down furniture and a window that only opened an inch. Linda slipped a business card to Silas with a handwritten note about the extra service fee they had discussed. She told him she would have the papers ready for Monday and to just make sure the consultant fee cleared first. She looked at me and said it was a lovely view and that I would never want to leave. I realized then that I had captured enough audio of their conspiracy to burn this entire place down, but a new horror struck me. As we passed the on-site pharmacy, I saw the order for my stabilization cocktail being prepared. It was specifically designed to mimic the stroke symptoms that killed Jessica, a chemical execution, waiting for me in a small plastic cup. As we walked back to the car, Silas patted my shoulder, his hand feeling like a slab of cold meat. He told me that Monday was going to be the start of a whole new life for me. The interior of Silas's Lexus smelled like leather and lies as we pulled away from the curb. I slumped against the cold leather headrest in the back seat, letting my jaw hang slack and my breathing go shallow, transforming myself into the harmless, empty vessel they wanted me to be. To them, I was already a ghost, a remnant of a man whose only remaining utility was a signature. Silas steered the car onto Highway 99 West, the rhythmic thrum of tires on the interstate creating a hypnotic pulse that masked the mechanical hum of my modified hearing aid. Believing I was out cold, Leone popped a piece of mint gum and leaned toward the driver's seat. She laughed a sharp, brittle sound, noting that the facility had really taken the fight out of me. She revealed that she had been intercepting Briar's calls to the farm for weeks, ensuring that the only information our doctor-daughter received was a curated list of my supposed episodes. Silas gripped the steering wheel, the orange glow of the setting sun hitting the dashboard and reflecting in his eyes. He asked if Briar would really go through with it, and Leone assured him that if a cardiologist signed off on the symptoms, no court in Oregon would touch them. Honk. Silas tapped the horn at a stray deer, a sound that vibrated through my skull like a funeral bell. But I didn't flinch. I kept my performance flawless as Leone detailed the final logistics of the natural gas lease. The drilling equipment was already staged 3 miles away, waiting for the legal gates to open. She spoke of my Jessica with a casual cruelty, remarking that she should have sold nicely and wouldn't have had to suffer if she hadn't been so stubborn. I felt a surge of cold fury when Silas didn't defend his mother's memory. Instead, he agreed that the farm was a wasted legacy and that they were finally putting the soil to good use. "Do you ever feel bad about Mom?" Silas asked, his voice momentarily thin. Leone's reply was a whetstone for my rage. She said she felt bad that Jessica was so difficult. They were just finishing what she wouldn't start. How do you quantify the cost of a son's soul when it's being traded for a lease agreement? By the time we reached the farm, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the house in a tomb of shadows. Silas helped me stumble into the entryway, his touch a sickening display of false care. Once the SUV's taillights faded down the driveway, I stood straight, the fatigue vanishing in the wake of tactical necessity. I pulled the recorder from my ear, my fingers trembling with a grim triumph. I connected the cold metallic click of the device to the e-reader's charging port and watched the blue light of the sync progress. I uploaded the entire car confession to the secure cloud drive Alaric had established, ensuring that even if I didn't survive the weekend, the truth was already out of their reach. I discovered through Leone's earlier whisper that the consultant fee Silas had mentioned was actually a bribe to the county coroner to ensure a full autopsy was never performed on my wife. "You just signed your own warrants, Silas?" I thought, staring at the screen. I saw the blinking upload icon turn into a solid notification. Upload complete. I stared at the rectangle of light in the dark kitchen, realizing I still hadn't listened to the one file Jessica had labeled with only my name. The kitchen was a tomb of shadows, the only light coming from the glowing rectangle of the e-reader in my hand. I didn't stay there. I retreated to the soundproofed basement workshop, the one place where the air still felt honest even if it was cold. The e-reader screen glowed like a radioactive ember in the basement's shadows, mocking me with the one file I had been too terrified to open, the one Jessica had titled The Pawn. I sat at my workbench, the flickering, dying fluorescent light overhead, casting jittery shadows across my tools. My hands shook as I navigated the interface. I found myself whispering to the empty room, pleading with the memory of my wife. "Please, Jessica, don't let it be him. I'm sorry I wasn't there to see the wolf in the fold." I was thinking of Beckett Garrison, the 35-year-old youngest child, whose eyes still carried the shaky light of early recovery. I recalled his history with addiction and the way Silas always acted as the hero who bailed him out. I finally pressed play. The audio opened with a static, heavy hiss, the background filled with the faint smell of diesel fuel and old hay sounds from the farm's old tractor shed. I discovered quickly that Silas specifically targeted Beckett for a darknet purchase because Beckett's prior criminal record would make him the perfect fall guy if the poison was ever discovered. Silas's voice was low and predatory, reminding Beckett of the $10,000 in drug debts Silas had supposedly erased for him. Silas instructed a shaky-sounding Beckett to use his old darknet contacts to order herbal boosters for their mother. He framed it as a secret way to bypass my stubborn refusal to use modern medicine, weaponizing Beckett's desperate desire to help Jessica. Crack. I squeezed the e-reader so hard, I thought the plastic would shatter along with my heart. "It's just an herbal supplement," Silas's low, confident voice vibrated through the speakers. "Dad's too old to understand." "Do you want Mom to suffer?" "I don't know." Silas Beckett replied, his voice thick with the pathetic, desperate gratitude of a man who thought he was being saved. "Ordering stuff like that is how I got in trouble last time." The recording captured Silas handing him a prepaid crypto card and a list of specific vendors. He promised Beckett that this would square their debt and make him the family's savior. "You'll be a hero," Silas urged. "Now go home and order the blue supplement. Jessica needs it." My eyes stung with salt as I realized that Silas didn't just kill my wife. He used our brother's trauma as the murder weapon. How can a man share the same blood as a brother he's prepping for a prison cell? The final seconds of the recording were the most brutal. Silas mentioned the debt again, but his tone shifted when Beckett stepped away. In a muffled aside, Silas revealed that he didn't just bail Beckett out. He was secretly the one who had informed the police about Beckett's previous drug deal to create that debt in the first place. He had manufactured Beckett's ruin years ago, just to have a tool ready for this moment. I turned off the device, the silence of the basement suddenly heavier than the earth above it, and realized there was one person I had to find before Breyer arrived in the morning. Silas hadn't just stolen a life. He had tried to bury 2 sons under the weight of his own greed. I didn't wait for dawn. I climbed the basement stairs, my legs heavy, but my path clear. The house was silent, yet every floorboard seemed to scream with the betrayal I had just heard. I stood on the porch, the dawn light bleeding over the hazelnut trees like a bruised ego, watching the silver SUV of my daughter, the one with the stethoscope and the clinical coldness, climb the long gravel driveway. Breyer arrived at the farm with a rhythmic crunch of gravel that sounded like a countdown. She stepped out of the vehicle wearing her medical scrubs, the sterile scent of the hospital still clinging to her like a protective layer of armor. She didn't offer a hug. Instead, she greeted me with a lingering diagnostic gaze, checking my pupils and the steadiness of my gait, as if I were a specimen in a lab. "You look tired, Dad," she said, her voice stripped of daughterly warmth. "Silas said your coordination was off yesterday." I leaned against the porch railing, feeling the damp morning mist on my neck. "Silas says a lot of things, Breyer. Come inside. The coffee is fresh." As we walked through the door, she revealed she hadn't just come to check on my health. She reached into her bag and pulled out commitment papers that Silas had already pre-signed, intending to force me into Riverside today if I showed even a flicker of instability. The clinical precision of the ambush made my stomach turn. I led her into the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of high-octane espresso I had brewed to keep my hands from shaking. I refused to engage in her memory tests or the practiced medical small talk she used to maintain distance. Thump. Breyer's medical bag hit the floor, the stethoscope clinking like chains in the sterile silence of the room. I maintained a stoic, almost unnerving silence that forced her to stop her interrogation. "I am not here to play Dr. Breyer," I said, my voice low and authoritative. "I am here to be your father." I placed the e-reader and the heavy, cold, noise-canceling headphones on the scarred oak table. I gestured for her to sit in the very chair where Jessica used to record her logs. "Just listen," I commanded. "Don't speak until the files are done." She put on the headphones with a weary, skeptical sigh, her posture radiating the belief that she was humoring the ramblings of a grieving, confused mind. "How many years of medical training does it take to recognize the sound of your own mother accusing your brother of murder?" I watched her face closely as the first audio file started. I saw the exact moment her professional mask began to crack, the subtle, sudden widening of her eyes when she heard Jessica's voice describing the specific lethal dosage of warfarin. "Wait, that's Mom," she whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for the volume. "Listen to the science, Briar," I told her. "You're the cardiologist." She looked toward the window, her eyes darting as if searching for an escape, but I knew I had an ally she didn't know about. I had Beckett watching the back of the house the entire time from the old barn, ensuring that Silas hadn't followed her to the farm to interrupt this moment. Briar's hand flew to her mouth, her face going a ghostly, clinical white, as Jessica's voice on the recording whispered, "Briar, if you're hearing this, it's because Silas thinks you're as blind as your father." The kitchen clock ticked like a countdown as I watched my daughter become a doctor again. But this time, the patient was her own soul. I watched the clinical armor of my daughter shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces, the cardiologist replaced by a terrified child who had just heard her mother's death sentence narrated in her own voice. Briar ripped off the headphones, her hands shaking so violently she nearly knocked the cold coffee over. She began to hyperventilate, the sharp, stinging cold of the kitchen floor forgotten, as her medical mind automatically cross-referenced Jessica's described symptoms: the bruising, the dizziness, the metallic taste with chronic warfarin toxicity. She realized then that Silas had been sending her altered blood work results from a private lab for months, masking the poison as a natural decline in health. "I missed it, Dad." She choked out, her voice a ragged, panicked whisper. I looked at the chart Silas gave me instead of looking at my own mother. High-dose warfarin. It mimics a hemorrhagic stroke perfectly. He knew exactly what he was doing. I sat in silence, letting the weight of her guilt settle before I showed her the forged will and the financial logs I had discovered with Alaric. Briar stared at the digital screen, the sight of the forged signature illuminating the dark reality of our situation. She realized that Silas didn't just want the land. He wanted to erase everyone who could contest his right to it. She recalled the phone calls where Silas subtly steered her away from visiting, realizing now that it was a coordinated isolation campaign. Shatter. Briar's grip tightened until the ceramic mug in her hand developed a hairline fracture, a silent scream in the quiet room that mirrored the internal collapse of her world. The realization that her brother had used her medical license as a shield for his crime turned her grief into a cold, focused fury. "He used me, Dad," she said, her eyes now burning with a rising rage. "He used my title to keep you locked in his narrative. Silas didn't just kill her. He made us accomplices in his silence." I watched her transformation, the clinical mask, replaced by a warrior's resolve. Can a house built on 40 years of love survive a flood of such absolute calculated evil? I believed it could, provided we were willing to fight as dirty as the vultures circling us. Briar stood up, her medical bag gripped like a weapon. She agreed to join my counter-trap, promising to use her status as a doctor to lead Silas into a false sense of security. We began planning the family meeting for Sunday night, where she would pretend to be the one enforcing the Riverside commitment. "I'm going to make him feel safe, Dad." She promised, her voice like strategic steel. "I'm going to be the doctor he expects. We don't just stop them, Briar." I reminded her as a distant truck passed the house, vibrating with the omen of our task. "We destroy them." She revealed then that she had access to Silas's private medical portal and could see that he'd already been researching end-of-life care for me, confirming that Monday was intended to be my final sunset. Briar looked me dead in the eye, her medical bag gripped like a weapon. "He wants a doctor to sign those papers tomorrow, Dad. I'll give him exactly what he wants." The plan wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. The farmhouse didn't just have walls anymore. It had eyes, tiny, unblinking lenses hidden behind every family portrait and within the hollowed-out spines of Jessica's favorite books. At dusk, Alaric Benedict arrived with Corbin Mercer and a specialized tech team disguised as a plumbing crew. They moved through the halls with military precision, the metallic smell of wire strippers and solder soon mixing with the scent of old wood. I watched as Corbin opened a panel behind a picture of my wedding day, his fingers deftly threading a fiber optic camera into the drywall. I realized that the plumbing crew Alaric had hired was actually composed of off-duty state investigators, men whose presence ensured that the chain of custody for every pixel of digital evidence would remain unbroken. My sanctuary was being transformed into a high-stakes surveillance hub, a cold necessity that felt like peeling back my own skin. "Corbin," I whispered, watching the blue, ghostly glow of his laptop as he tested the feed, "make sure the audio is clean. I need every rasp of Silas's greed captured." He nodded without looking up, assuring me that once they started talking, they were done. In the dining room, Briar was working with Alaric to rehearse her role. I stood in the doorway observing my daughter's transformation into a double agent. She was practicing the clinical detached tone of a doctor, resigning her father to state care. Her face a mask of professional resignation that made my heart ache. She helped place the microphones in the centerpiece, positioning them exactly where Silas and Leon were most likely to lean in when they spoke of their fracking millions. "I have to sound like I've given up on you, Dad," she said, her voice briefly cracking. "It's the only way he'll drop his guard." Red. A tiny LED light blinked from the smoke detector, the eye of the storm watching me from above. It was a silent witness to the shared burden we were now carrying, a professional resolve that felt as heavy as the house itself. With the team finally hidden away in the basement, I sat in the kitchen, the flickering shadows of the hazelnut trees dancing against the window. I picked up the phone, my fingers steady even as I prepared to lie to my own flesh and blood. I called Silas, adopting the shaky, compliant voice of a man who had finally been broken by the weight of his own supposed mind. "Son, I think I'm ready," I said, letting a faint tremor seep into my words. "I don't want to be a burden anymore. I think Monday is the right choice." Silas didn't even hesitate. His voice over the line was a greedy, breathless laugh of relief. "That's the right choice, Dad," he replied. "Leon already has the papers ready. We'll be there Sunday at 6. Have you ever invited your own executioners to dinner, just to see the look on their faces when the rope breaks during the call?" Silas mentioned almost casually that they'd already sold my old truck to a local wholesaler, proving they considered the farm transition a fait accompli. He didn't even think I'd need a way to leave anymore. I hung up the phone and looked at Briar, my voice returning to its true cold steel as the investigator in the basement signaled a successful recording. "They're coming," I told her, my eyes fixed on the driveway. "And they're bringing the devil with them." The farmhouse was quiet once the team retreated to the basement, but the silence felt like a coiled spring. I made my way to my bedroom, moving slow, my footsteps heavy on the floorboards that had supported me for 42 years. The house felt like a hollowed-out skull, but in the quiet of my room, the scent of Jessica's lavender sachets still lingered, a ghostly reminder of the woman I was about to avenge. I sat on the edge of the bed we shared, feeling the softness of the worn quilt beneath my calloused palms. I avoided the downstairs where the investigators and Corbin were huddled around monitors. I needed a moment of genuine connection before the final performance began. I picked up the e-reader, my thumb hovering over the file labeled simply, "For Thane, my love." I discovered then that Jessica had known she was dying months before the stroke that eventually took her. She had spent that final season intentionally setting up this digital device as her final witness, knowing the vultures would ignore a simple tablet in favor of the larger assets. "One more time, Jessica," I whispered to the empty air. "Just let me hear you one more time. I'm not ready to say goodbye, but I am ready to fight." I pressed play, and her voice filled the room, soft, intimate, and stripped of the clinical distance found in the earlier surveillance logs. Unlike the grainy audio from the tractor shed, this recording was filled with a tragic, haunting beauty. She didn't talk about poison or deeds. She spoke about the morning mist in the orchards and the way I looked at her when we planted our first oak decades ago. Silence. The audio cut for a second, and for one terrifying heartbeat, I thought I'd lost her forever. But then her breath returned to the speaker. "Look for me in the trees." "Thane," she said, her voice a warm, grainy texture that made my chest tighten. "Every time the wind moves the leaves, that's me telling you I'm proud. You were always the strong one. Don't let their lies make you feel small. How can a few megabytes of data carry the weight of a 42-year marriage?" I listened to her. "Give me permission to be the man she knew, the one who protects the truth even when the world is burning." The recording ended with a specific plea to save Beckett, whom she knew was being manipulated by Silas's cruelty. She told me that justice is a harvest that takes time, and that I had to be the one to gather it. I closed my eyes as the rhythmic ticking of the bedside clock marked the passage toward dawn. A cold, crystalline resolve settled in my chest, more potent than any grief. I realized I wasn't just a victim or a mole in this play. I was the keeper of her legacy, and tomorrow I would be the storm that cleared the valley. "I hear you, Jess," I said, the tears finally stopping. "I'll save our boy, and I'll bury the wolves." As I turned the device over in my hands, I noticed a slight seam I hadn't seen before. I discovered a physical map, hidden inside the e-reader's protective case, a hand-drawn guide showing exactly where the surveillance equipment was focused in the orchard. I tucked the e-reader under my pillow, the blue light fading as the first hint of gray light touched the horizon. "Good morning, Silas," I whispered to the dark. "It's time to sign your life away." The morning of the reckoning arrived with a deceptive calm. I stood before the hallway mirror, deliberately buttoning my cardigan unevenly, watching a stranger with hollow eyes and a slack jaw stare back at me, a perfect, pathetic decoy. This scratchy wool was my costume, the mismatched buttons my armor. I moved to the kitchen and placed a half-eaten cold piece of toast on the counter, a small detail, to simulate a mind that had forgotten its own breakfast. I even left my hair uncombed, letting the silver strands stand at jagged angles. I checked the hidden monitor tucked behind the boxes of cereal in the pantry, seeing Corbin's green light signal that the surveillance network was live and broadcasting every shadow to Alaric's remote server. I adjusted the device in my left ear, then reached for the one in my right. I had a second hearing aid now, one that didn't record, but instead allowed me to hear the tech team's live commentary from the basement. It was my direct line to the men who would eventually become Silas's jailers. "They want a victim," I whispered to my reflection. "I'll give them a masterpiece. Checkmate starts with a pawn's first move." I walked through the living room, touching the grain of the furniture and the edges of the frames Jessica had loved. I stopped at her favorite armchair, the one where she spent her afternoons reading until the tremor in her hand became too much. A sudden warm draft brushed against my cheek, a ghostly warm sensation of her presence, giving me the strength to endure the coming humiliation. It was as if she were standing right there, leaning in to offer a blessing before the storm broke. "I'm doing this for our boy Jess," I thought, my heart swelling with a poignant resolve. "For the land. Stay close. I'm going to need you when the yelling starts." Every "I don't remember" I was about to utter today would be a nail in Silas's legal coffin, a necessary lie to bring about a greater truth. Crunch. The sound of tires on gravel was the firing of the starter's pistol. The low rumble of an engine vibrated through the old floorboards, shaking the very foundation of my home. I quickly moved to the kitchen table, slumping my shoulders and letting my gaze drift toward the window, purposely out of focus. Through the security feed on my phone, which I tucked beneath a folded newspaper, I watched Silas's Lexus pull into the yard, followed closely by Leon's sleek SUV. They looked like people of business, sharp and efficient, never realizing they were walking into a cage. How many times had I welcomed that son home with a hug, never realizing I was embracing a snake? I felt a lethal focus sharpen my mind, even as I kept my face as blank as unwritten paper. Here come the wolves. Time to open the door. As I watched the cars stop, I noticed a third vehicle trailing the vultures, a nondescript white van that hadn't been part of the plan. I realized with a jolt of ice in my veins that it was Nurse Linda arriving early to ensure the sedation protocol started before Briar could even intervene. They weren't just coming for a signature, they were coming to put me under. The doorbell chimed a cheerful domestic sound that felt like a death knell, and I took one last deep breath of the man I used to be before I stood up to play the fool. The front door swung open, and the smell of Leon's cloying perfume flooded the entryway like a chemical spill. I pulled the door open, my posture slumping into the fragile frame of a broken man, as the evening chill rushed in to meet the two wolves standing on my welcome mat. Silas stepped forward, first offering a shallow, performative hug that felt like being measured for a casket. "You look, well, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with a practiced pity that made my skin crawl. "A bit disoriented, but that's why we're here." Leon stood just behind him, her eyes immediately scanning the foyer for any sign of the e-reader they thought they had secured. Beyond them, in the growing shadows of the driveway, I noticed a third vehicle, a nondescript white van. It confirmed that Nurse Linda had arrived early, a silent vulture waiting to facilitate my abduction the moment the ink dried. "I just wanted to see my children," I whispered, letting my gaze wander aimlessly. The trees. They were talking so loud today. I discovered quickly that Silas hadn't come alone. He had a private notary waiting in his car, ready to make my signature legally binding before the first course was even served. I led them into the dining room, where Briar was already seated, her face a mask of clinical detachment that mirrored the sterile brightness of the chandelier overhead. Silas was visibly agitated, checking his watch every few minutes and sweating through the collar of his expensive dress shirt. Clack! Leon's briefcase latches snapped open, a sound like a predator's teeth meeting in the quiet room. She assumed the role of the savior, speaking in a soothing, manipulative tone about how much easier my life would be once I signed away my burdens. "It's a beautiful facility, Thane," she cooed, sliding a leather-bound folder onto the table among the plates of untouched food. "You'll have all the care Jessica would have wanted for you. Briar agrees that we need to move fast." I watched a moth flicker against the glass crystals above us, its shadow dancing over the signature lines. How many times can a man watch his own son try to bury him before he stops feeling the pain of the shovel? Silas cleared a space on the table with an aggressive sweep of his hand, flipping to the power of attorney and the Riverside admission pages. He accidentally revealed then that he had already promised the upcoming hazelnut harvest to a wholesale buyer in Salem, proving he was liquidating the farm's future before I had even touched the pen. "Just sign here," Dad. Silas urged, his hand visibly shaking with a mixture of greed and nerves. "Then we can eat. Then everything goes back to being simple." I stared at the lines, pretending to struggle with the concept of the pen. Where do I put the ink?" I asked, my voice thin and trembling. "My hand feels so heavy today." Silas leaned in, his wet, heavy breathing sounding like a predator closing in on a wounded animal. I picked up the heavy fountain pen, the cold, tactile weight of it, anchoring me to the reality of the trap. My nib hovered just millimeters above the line that would strip me of my life when a sharp, electronic chirp sounded from my pocket, the signal from Corbin in the basement that the recording was live and the trap was fully set. The pen clattered onto the table like a bone on a drum, and as I straightened my spine, the vacant fog in my eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory clarity that made Silas recoil. I reached into my pocket and pressed a button on the remote, activating the whole house speaker system Corbin had wired just hours before. The room didn't just fill with sound, it was haunted. Jessica's voice, clear and accusing, poured from the dining room speakers, detailing the specific night she watched Silas swap her blood thinners for high-dose poison. The vultures froze mid-celebration, their faces draining of color as they realized the confused old man they'd come to bury was actually a Trojan horse. "I'm not signing anything, Silas," I said, my voice steady and lethal. "But your mother has a few things to say to you." Silas lunged for the folder, but I slammed my hand down on it first. I discovered then that I was broadcasting every gasp of their panic, live to Alaric's office, where a court reporter and 2 state investigators were recording every word as a formal deposition. Silas screamed at me to turn it off, claiming it was some kind of sick joke, but his eyes were wide with a terrifying realization. I switched the feed to the recording from the Lexus. The high-pitched distortion of the speakers didn't hide the sound of their laughter as they discussed manipulating Briar and stripping the land. Briar stood up her chair, screeching against the hardwood, her eyes blazing with a fury that finally silenced Silas. "You used my medical license to kill our mother." She whispered the words, hitting Silas like physical blows. "Stop." The music in Silas's head stopped, replaced by the sound of his own death warrant as the recording continued. "It's not what it sounds like." Silas stammered, looking at the ceiling as if the speakers were judge and jury. "Before I let you hear the conversation that ties this all together, are you still with me? Comment guilty or innocent, and add 1 reason why, so I can see how you're judging this family. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to convey the core message. If you're not comfortable with dramatized details, you're free to exit now." The recording shifted to Leone's secret negotiation with Nurse Linda. Leone offered a 15% stake in the fracking rights if Linda ensured I was erased through medical compliance. In that moment, the actual Nurse Linda stepped into the dining room doorway from the kitchen, holding a tray of tea that she promptly dropped. The sound of ceramic shattering joined the mechanical whine of the audio. Linda didn't wait for an accusation. She immediately turned on Leone, screaming that she had been forced into the deal and that Leone had told her I was already terminal. "Shut up." Linda Leone hissed, her face a mask of jagged sociopathic rage. "Have you ever seen a sociopath realize they've been the one being played?" Linda revealed that she had a recording of her own Leone handing her the initial cash bribe. The smell of fierce sweat and cold gravy hung heavy in the air as the 2 women began a frantic blame game. Leone lunged across the table, her fingernails clawing for my throat, her eyes reflecting the blinding flash of the chandelier. Just as she moved, the sound of heavy boots shattered the front door's frame, and the wood splintered inward as the world I had known finally collapsed to make room for the truth. The dining room exploded into a kaleidoscope of blue and red light as the first officers breached the sanctuary. The air didn't just vibrate. It shattered as the front door gave way, and the focused beams of tactical flashlights cut through the expensive candlelight like surgical lasers. Leone was mid-lunge, her fingers still clawing for my throat, when a broad-shouldered officer intercepted her. He pinned her against the mahogany table with a jarring thud while she screamed obscenities about asset interference and legal overreach. Silas remained frozen in his chair, his face a pale, sweating mask of shock. The metallic snap of handcuffs echoed through the hollow silence of the farmhouse, a sound far more final than any spoken word. As Leone Ross was informed she was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, she spit at the boots of the men restraining her, her sociopathic mask fully discarded. The chaos of the arrests provided a stark, ugly contrast to the calm, digital voice of Jessica still looping in the background, a ghost witnessing the fall of the house she had once loved. I stood perfectly still, watching the predators become prey, feeling a heavy sense of vindication that felt more like lead than gold in my chest. The lead detective, a man with eyes like flint and a jaw set in a permanent scowl, began reciting the Miranda rights to a weeping Silas and a stony-faced Linda. "Stop." The loop of Jessica's voice finally hissed into static, leaving only the sound of Silas's sobbing. The sudden quiet was deafening. Silas collapsed to his knees, finally looking at me, not as a victim, but as the man who had outplayed him at his own game. He began a frantic, incoherent confession. Right there on the rug, his words a muddy flood of cowardice. He claimed Leone's financial pressure had forced his hand, but as he spoke of every pill he had swapped in my wife's bottle, my disgust only deepened. You knew exactly what you were doing every time you opened that bottle, Silas. I said, my voice as cold as the Oregon soil. In a final desperate act of spite, he revealed that he never actually paid the Riverside deposit. He had spent that money on a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country, planning to leave me to rot in a state ward once the deed was transferred. The handcuffs didn't just bind their wrists. They severed the last rotted threads of the family tree. The police led the three of them out into the cold Oregon night, the smell of ozone and damp earth rushing in through the ruined doorway. I stood on the porch, feeling Briar's trembling hand on my arm, watching the rhythmic pulse of police lights bounce off the ancient oak trees. One of the arresting officers paused as he passed me, his eyes softening for a brief second. I discovered then that he was the son of the pharmacist Jessica had visited in secret, revealing that the local community had been protecting me from the shadows all along. "It's over," Dad Briar whispered, her breath hitching in the cold, biting wind of the valley. "They're gone." I looked down the long gravel drive as the taillights disappeared. "No, Briar," I replied, my hand tightening on her shoulder. "Now the real work begins." I turned back toward the house, but as the last police cruiser turned onto the main road, I saw a lone figure sitting on the edge of the hazelnut grove, and my heart nearly stopped again. The figure in the shadows didn't move as I approached his silhouette, small against the massive weight of the orchard. I didn't call out to him. I simply walked, my boots heavy in the damp Oregon soil, toward the trembling shadow of the sun I had almost let the wolves devour. The air smelled of damp moss and rotted leaves, the scent of a season turning cold and unforgiving. As I got closer, I found Beckett huddled at the base of an ancient hazelnut tree, clutching his knees and weeping with a primal, gut-wrenching intensity. When he saw me, he tried to scramble away, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. I noticed then that his skin was clammy, his hands shaking with a tremor that wasn't just fear. I realized with a sudden sharp pang that he had been trying to test those supplements himself, exhibiting the same mild poisoning symptoms Silas had likely dismissed as a simple withdrawal from his old addiction. "Don't touch me, Dad," Beckett wailed, his voice cracking. "I'm the one who bought it. I killed her." I reached out and physically restrained him, pulling him into an embrace, not with anger, but with the desperate strength of a father refusing to let the darkness win. "You didn't buy poison, Beckett," I whispered into his hair. "You bought a lie. Look at me." I led my nearly catatonic son back toward the farmhouse, bypassing the dining room, where the cloying scent of Leon's perfume still lingered like a stain on the air. I settled him into the study, the very room where Silas had sat comfortably while practicing his forgeries. Quiet. The only sound in the farmhouse was the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the grandfather clock, measuring out the ruins of our family. Beckett began to stammer out the details of the darknet orders, his voice barely a whisper. He told me how Silas had convinced him it would give Jessica energy, that I was too stubborn to save her myself. Every blue supplement he had lovingly handed to his mother had been a bullet Silas had put in the chamber. "He used your love for her as a murder weapon, Beck," I told him, my voice thick with a protective fury. "That's on him, not you. How do you mend a boy who has been forged into a blade meant for his own mother's heart?" Alaric Benedict entered the study then, his professional armor softening as he looked at my broken youngest child. He immediately asserted legal privilege, his flinty eyes promising a different kind of justice. Alaric explained that we needed to document every crypto transfer and every text to ensure Silas and Leon never saw the sun as free people again. He set a digital recorder on the desk, its low, rhythmic hum a steady pulse in the room. I noticed the flickering shadow of hazelnut branches against the study window, looking like reaching fingers. Alaric revealed one final piece of evidence he'd found: Silas had opened a hidden offshore account in Beckett's name. It was a final insurance policy designed to frame his own brother for the entire financial fraud if the murder ever came to light. The bitter taste of iron filled my mouth as I looked at my son. "I'll tell you everything," Beckett whispered, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. "Just don't let them come back here." He looked up at me, then his face pale in the lamplight. "Dad, there's a second package. It's already in the house." The word package hit me like a physical blow, sending my gaze darting around the study for any sign of a hidden threat. I tore the family photos from the mantel, my heart hammering against my ribs, looking for the poison my son said was already waiting to finish what Silas had started. Beckett sat slumped in the wingback chair, his voice a hollow rasp, as he pointed toward the corner of the room. He told me that Silas had instructed him to hide a second delivery in case I got difficult before the Monday move. I approached the grandfather clock, its rhythmic, heavy tick, sounding like a countdown to a funeral I wasn't ready to attend. My fingers searched the dark mahogany housing until they caught on something smooth. I pulled away a small, vacuum-sealed pouch taped inside the casing. I discovered then that this wasn't another slow-acting supplement. It was a high-concentration liquid warfarin, a lethal kill shot intended for my very first night at Riverside to ensure my death looked like a natural secondary stroke. I handed the pouch to Alaric, the clinical crinkle of his evidence gloves sounding unnervingly loud in the quiet room. "This isn't just a chemical, Alaric," I said, the taste of stale coffee and bitter regret coating my tongue. "It is a signature on my death warrant." Alaric nodded solemnly, his professional mask tightening as he secured the physical link to Silas's darknet activities. Buzz. Alaric's phone vibrated on the oak table, the sound of a guillotine blade sliding into place. It was 2 a.m, but the world of high-stakes law never sleeps. He had used his high-level contacts to bypass the local sheriff, reaching the state attorney general directly. Alaric had transmitted the car recordings and the crypto logs Beckett provided, and the response was immediate. The farmhouse was now designated a secondary crime scene, and the state was taking over the investigation to prevent any interference from Silas's business associates in the valley. I stood in the kitchen, watching the blue official tint of a digital warrant manifest on Alaric's tablet. Breyer asked if this meant they finally believed us about Jessica, and Alaric simply looked at the screen with a grim satisfaction. The AG had seen more than enough. How do you explain to the earth that you have to take back what you gave it just to prove a crime? As the sun began to rise over the hazelnut trees, the morning mist clinging to the windows like a shroud, the final order arrived. The state attorney general had formally ordered the immediate exhumation of Jessica's body. They needed the tissue proof to turn intent into a murder conviction. I stood by the window, watching the gray light touch the orchards, realizing that justice required me to disturb the final rest of the woman I had loved for 40 years. They need her. Thane Alaric said, his voice soft but firm. The recordings show the plan, but her body holds the evidence. I took a deep breath, the smell of cold morning mist, and turned earth, drifting through a cracked pane. "Wake her up then," I whispered. "Tell her I'm finishing the harvest." Alaric revealed that the state AG's office had already been flagged by the McMinnville pharmacist weeks ago, proving a quiet net was being woven long before I ever stepped foot in Portland. The lead investigator stepped onto the porch, his eyes heavy with the weight of the warrant. "Mr. Garrison, the backhoe is at the cemetery. We need you to identify the site." The cemetery was a sea of gray stone and iron gates, the morning fog clinging to the ground like a shroud. I stood at the perimeter of the family plot, the soil of the Willamette Valley famous for giving life. But as the backhoe's metal teeth bit into the earth, it felt like the valley was vomiting up a secret it was never meant to hold. The smell of damp peat and hydraulic fluid hung heavy in the air, a mechanical intrusion into a place of sacred rest. I watched the excavator's rhythmic thud with a hollow chest, flanked by Alaric and Breyer. My daughter's professional mask was back in place as she consulted with the lead investigator on medical markers, but I could see the tremor in her hands. Alaric tried to reassure me that they were being careful, but I told him careful was for the living. For Jessica, this was just another violation. I discovered then that the initial coroner's report had conveniently been lost in a local server crash months ago, a detail that confirmed Silas's influence over the county's digital infrastructure. It wasn't just a murder. It was a systemic deletion of the truth. I remained in a silent vigil until the vault was finally secured and loaded into a specialized state transport van. Bang! The van door slammed shut, echoing against the marble headstones like a closing cell door. The sound signaled the end of her piece and the beginning of a cold, forensic reckoning. The lead investigator informed me that the toxicology screen would be expedited, focused specifically on the chemical markers of warfarin found in the second package I'd retrieved from the clock. Every minute she was above ground felt like a minute Silas was still breathing free air, and that thought kept me standing despite the exhaustion. 24 hours later, I found myself in the sterile boardroom of the State Attorney General's office in Salem. The gray, unrelenting rain of a Tuesday beat against the glass, and the room smelled sharply of bleach and old paper. The medical examiner, a woman with tired eyes and a steady voice, delivered the verdict. Jessica's liver and bone marrow showed warfarin levels 40 times the therapeutic maximum. The stroke that had killed my wife was no accident. It was a catastrophic, intentional bleed. How many CCS of poison does it take to erase 42 years of marriage? I watched the examiner's hand move with a slow, deliberate grace as she signed the updated death certificate. The rasp of the pen on that thick official document was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in weeks. The cause of death was no longer listed as natural. The word homicide stared back at me in bold black ink. Finally, the paper said what the e-reader had already told me. It wasn't a stroke, Thane, the examiner said softly. It was an execution. Alaric leaned toward me, then revealing that the state had already upgraded the charges against Silas and Leone to first-degree murder. In Oregon, that meant a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. My son would spend the rest of his days behind the very bars he'd tried to build for me. Alaric put his hand on my shoulder, his voice dropping to a whisper as the gravity of the wind settled over us. Thane, Silas's lawyer, is already calling. He wants to talk deal. The word deal tasted like iron and ash in my mouth. The legal system is a marketplace where souls are bartered for years, and my eldest son was currently trying to sell his lover's life just to buy himself a shorter sentence. Alaric sat across from me in his Portland office, his face a map of weary professional cynicism as he detailed the offer Silas's lawyer had floated to the state attorney. My son wanted to trade Leone's head for his own freedom, offering full testimony against both her and Nurse Linda in exchange for dropping the murder charge to manslaughter. He was painting himself as a passive participant, a man supposedly coerced by Leone's dominant personality and financial expertise. I discovered through Alaric that Silas had been recording Leone for months, as insurance essentially planning to betray her long before the police ever arrived at our door. "Tell the lawyer my son can keep his deals," I said, my voice as cold as the frost on a dead branch. "I want the truth, not a bargain." I refused to even consider the offer until Silas faced the full weight of Jessica's recordings in a court of law. Hope is a dangerous weed in a garden of grief, but I felt it tugging at my heart anyway as I left the city behind. I drove east the road, climbing toward a quiet, wooded rehabilitation center tucked away in the Cascades. This was where Beckett had been placed for detoxification and psychiatric evaluation. The air was different here, smelling of pine needles and industrial floor cleaner instead of the stale perfume of a crime scene. I waited in a sun-drenched visiting room, the sound of a distant stream echoing through the open window. I felt the familiar, heavy anxiety of a father who had spent years bracing for his son's next relapse. Beckett appeared a few minutes later, and I was struck by the sight of him. He looked gaunt, but for the first time in years, his eyes were clear and his shaking hands became still as he sat across from me. "I didn't think you'd come, Dad." He whispered, his voice small. "I've spent 40 years coming for you, Beckett," I replied. "I'm not stopping now." I reached out and took his hand, noting the dry, papery feel of his skin. Thud. A pine cone hit the window, a small, natural sound, that felt louder than a gavel in the quiet room. We didn't talk about the case or the lawyers. Instead, Beckett asked about the hazelnut harvest and mentioned a specific graft Jessica was working on before she died. Mom said the new grafts would take 3 years, he said, his gaze drifting to the mountains. I want to see them bloom. In that moment, I saw the boy who used to help me in the orchards before the pills took hold. I realized that while Silas was a rot that had reached the core, Beckett might still be harvestable. Then stay clean, Beck, I told him. The trees need a garrison to look after them. As I stood to leave, Beckett pulled me close, whispering a secret that sent a new jolt of electricity through me. He told me that Jessica had left a physical letter hidden in a hollow tree in the orchard, specifically for me to find after the legal storm passed. I walked to my truck, the cold, biting mountain air of the Cascades stinging at my lungs, and realized I wasn't going home. I was going to find that hollow tree. The orchard was a sea of twisting branches and fading light. As I stepped back onto my land, my boots finding the familiar ruts of the harvest trail, I went straight to the hollow oak we called the wedding tree. My fingers trembling as I reached into the dark cavity where Jessica had promised her final truth lay. I discovered then that the letter Beckett mentioned wasn't just a goodbye. It contained a second hidden e-reader wrapped in oilcloth, containing video footage Jessica had taken of Leon actually handling the poison vials in our own kitchen. That discovery changed everything. Fast forward to the trial, where I stood in the center of the Yamhill County Courthouse, the air tasting of stale paper and high-stakes desperation. I watched Leon Ross adjust her designer suit, as if a sharp blazer could hide the blood on her hands. The trial opened with the testimony of Mr. Henderson, the town's pharmacist for 30 years. He adjusted his spectacles, his hands steady as he recounted the multiple occasions Silas tried to buy restricted blood thinners. Mrs. Garrison didn't look sick to me. She looked scared. Henderson said his small-town honesty acting as a bedrock of credibility. Scared of her own kitchen, the defense team screamed objections of speculation, but the jury was already leaning in. Click. The sound of the audio recorder starting felt like the cocking of a pistol. The prosecution introduced the files retrieved from my cloud backup, and the courtroom fell into a deathly silence as the recording of Leon and Silas in the Lexus played. Hearing Leon describe me as disposable overhead caused a visible ripple of disgust among the jurors. Silas sat with his head bowed, a broken man who had already traded his soul for a plea bargain. It's just business. Silas Leon's voice echoed through the high-fidelity speakers vibrating the very floorboards beneath my feet. The land doesn't care who signs the deed. Leon's attorney tried to have the recording struck, but the judge's face was like granite. How much does a human soul weigh when it's being measured in cubic centimeters of poison briar? Took the stand next as a medical expert witness, her cardiologist credentials lending undeniable weight to the toxicology report. She explained the chemical execution to the jury using simple, brutal metaphors to describe how the warfarin had slowly dissolved Jessica's vascular system from the inside out. My mother didn't have a stroke. Breyer said, her professional mask finally dropping to reveal a daughter's absolute loathing as she looked directly at Leon. She was drowned in her own blood. During the testimony, Silas's lawyer produced a final shocking twist, a document showing Leon had attempted to take out a secret life insurance policy on Silas as well, suggesting my son was to be her next target. The revelation turned the two conspirators into rabid animals. Leon's cool exterior finally shattered. She stood up screaming at Silas in front of the judge, her sharp, rhythmic tapping of her pen replaced by clawing fingers. I wasn't watching her anymore. I was watching the door as the bailiff brought in the final surprise witness. The courtroom doors creaked open, and the silence that followed was heavier than the evidence we had already presented. The courtroom doors creaked open, and the silence that followed was heavier than the evidence we had already presented. I watched the color drain from Leon's face as the man she thought she had silenced, Arthur Vance, A man who looked like he'd spent his entire life in a windowless server room walked toward the witness stand. He adjusted his tie with a trembling hand as he stepped into the light, carrying a folder full of her digital footprints. Arthur had been the IT director for her firm until he was fired for discrepancies, but he hadn't left empty-handed. He revealed to the court that he had archived Leone's encrypted communications, refusing to be her digital janitor any longer. He presented clear logs of Leone coordinating the purchase of the herbal supplements and her direct cold-blooded negotiations with the energy company. I felt a surge of heat as he revealed that Leone had even begun the paperwork to declare Silas incompetent too, intending to take every cent of the fracking profits for herself. The evidence was so damning that Leone's counsel insisted she take the stand, a desperate gamble to humanize a predator. Silence. You could hear a pin drop, or perhaps the sound of a woman's soul finally hitting the floor as she took the oath. Leone's voice was dripping with condescension from the moment she began to speak. She characterized my family as a collection of liabilities and argued that her actions were a form of necessary stewardship for land being wasted by an old man and a drug addict. Her refusal to acknowledge Jessica's death as anything more than an unfortunate timing issue sent a literal chill through the gallery. The smell of her expensive cloying perfume hit the front row like a warning. "Some people are architects of progress," she said, her voice vibrating with an arrogant shrillness, "and some are just obstacles." I sat gripped by a cold horror as she looked at the jury, clearly believing her own logic of superiority. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor asked if my wife was merely an obstacle to her commission. Leone lost her cool, her eyes flashing under the glare of the courtroom lights. She snapped that the weak deserved to be managed, justifying the poisoning as a mercy. She claimed the biological decline was already happening, and she had simply expedited a messy process. Her words were like dry ice burning cold, leaving nothing but scars and a faint chemical mist in the air. The jury stared in horrified silence, an audible gasp rippling through the room as she smiled. "I didn't kill her. I freed the land from her stagnation," she shrieked, her cool exterior finally shattered beyond repair. Leone then revealed she had hidden offshore accounts that the state hadn't found yet, taunting the court that money was the only true witness. No further questions. The prosecutor said, his voice a calm contrast to her mania. "Let the record show the defendant's own words." The judge slammed the gavel down to quiet the erupting gallery, the sharp, rhythmic crack echoing like a final judgment. Leone just looked at me and winked, a gesture so vile it made the victory feel like a fresh wound. I felt nauseated, but I didn't look away. I had watched her seal her own fate in a room full of people who finally saw the monster Jessica had died to expose. The wood of the courtroom bench felt like a church pew during a funeral, hard and unforgiving, as I watched the 12 strangers who held my family's final judgment file back into the box. I sat between Briar and Alaric, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and stale air. My daughter reached over her hand, trembling as she squeezed mine. "Whatever happens, Dad, we did it for her," she whispered. I looked ahead, my face a mask of stoic resignation. "It's not in our hands anymore, Briar," I replied. "It's in the truths." I looked across at Silas, who was shaking so violently that his water glass rattled against the defense table like a rhythmic warning. Just before the judge entered, my son tried to fire his lawyer in a last-ditch, pathetic effort to delay the proceedings, revealing the absolute desperation of a man who knew the earth was about to swallow him. The bailiff called for order, and the electric hum of the room seemed to intensify. Leone remained as still as a marble statue, her cold, unblinking stare fixed on the seal of the state of Oregon, as if she could negotiate with the wall itself. The judge asked the foreperson if a verdict had been reached. Click. The judge's gavel hit the block, a sound like a bone snapping in a quiet room, and the verdict for Silas was read first. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy, and guilty of financial fraud. Silas let out a high-pitched, keening wail that echoed off the high ceilings, collapsing into his chair as if his bones had turned to water. "No," he screamed, the wet sound of his sobbing filling the hallway. "I just wanted the money. I didn't mean to kill her." Then came Leone's verdict, identical in its finality. She didn't flinch, but I saw her jaw tighten just a fraction. The judge ordered the immediate remand of the defendants into state custody pending sentencing. I watched the sharp, metallic sound of handcuffs being tightened around their wrists, a sound that carried more weight than any ledger. Their guilt was a thick, cloying fog that finally lifted, leaving only the wreckage of my life visible in the sun. As the bailiffs began to lead them away, Leone finally turned her head toward me. "You think you've won, Thane?" She hissed, her voice a poisonous needle. "You're still an old man alone in the dirt." She leaned in as she passed, whispering that she'd already filed for bankruptcy to ensure my family would spend years fighting for the fracking rights in probate court. It was a final parting bite from a dying snake. I watched Silas being let out, his face buried in his hands, while Leone walked with her chin tilted up, refusing to admit defeat, even as the steel doors waited for her. I felt a sudden sharp clarity. The legal battle was won, but the house I was returning to was still empty. I walked out of the courthouse into the fading light, the orange glow of the sunset hitting the steps and casting long, jagged shadows. I reached my truck, my keys heavy in my pocket, but I didn't get in. Arthur Vance was waiting by the door with a man I didn't recognize, a man holding a federal badge that caught the last of the sun. The federal agent didn't look like a man interested in small-town justice. He looked like a man interested in the millions of dollars currently moving through Leone's offshore accounts. I stood on the courthouse steps, the federal agent's shadow stretching long across the pavement, realizing that while the state had taken my family's killers, the government was coming for their money. Agent Miller, a man with a suit as gray as his eyes and a federal badge that felt heavier than the law itself, stood waiting at my truck. He explained that Leone's consulting firm was merely a front for a multi-state racketeering operation involving fraudulent energy leases. I discovered then that Miller's presence had actually been requested by Alaric months ago. My lawyer had woven a safety net so tight that even a not guilty verdict in state court would have been met. With immediate federal shackles, Arthur Vance stood beside him, revealing he had been a federal informant for weeks, providing the digital breadcrumbs needed to freeze the offshore accounts Leone had so arrogantly bragged about. "Does this mean she won't have a penny left for an appeal?" I asked, feeling a calculated satisfaction wash over me. Miller simply nodded, noting that they were not there for the murder, but for the paper trail that allowed it. The energy company was about to be dismantled, piece by crooked piece. A month later, I returned for the final reckoning. The courtroom was packed for the sentencing phase, the air thick with the smell of old paper and heavy wood. Breyer and Beckett sat on either side of me, a fractured but unified front against the darkness. Before I hear the judge decide their permanent fate, I want to know if you're still watching this unfold with me. Comment justice or mercy and add a short reason why, so I can see how you're reading this final chapter. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to convey the core message. If this crosses your comfort line, you're free to exit now. Nurse Miller was sentenced first. She received 15 years for elder abuse and conspiracy, her professional license permanently revoked. She tried to apologize, her voice a pathetic whimper, but I refused to look at her, focusing instead on the deep grain of the oak bench. "You violated the most sacred trust a caregiver has," the judge declared, her words cutting through the sterile silence. Thud. The judge's gavel fell for the last time, a period at the end of a very long, dark sentence. She saved her harshest words for Silas and Leone, citing the premeditated and cannibalistic nature of their betrayal. She sentenced both to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Silas had to be physically carried from the room, his spirit completely broken, and his keening wails echoing through the gallery. Leone was led out in transport chains, the metallic jangle marking her rhythm as she avoided my gaze. As Silas was dragged past, a final realization struck me like a physical blow. The second package of poison hadn't been a backup for him to use. Leone had planted it to kill Silas too, intending to remove the last witness to her greed. He had been a victim in her eyes all along, a tool to be discarded once the harvest was in. Justice isn't a warm blanket. It's a cold, hard floor that you finally stop falling through. I walked out of the courtroom, the cold wind of the parking lot tasting like a promise of peace. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Alaric. The feds found the physical assets. You need to come to the office. I stood on the courthouse steps, the federal agent's shadow stretching long across the pavement, realizing that while the state had taken my family's killers, the government was coming for their money. Agent Miller, a man with a suit as gray as his eyes and a federal badge that felt heavier than the law itself, stood waiting at my truck. He explained that Leone's consulting firm was merely a front for a multi-state racketeering operation involving fraudulent energy leases. I discovered then that Miller's presence had actually been requested by Alaric months ago. My lawyer had woven a safety net so tight that even a not guilty verdict in state court would have been met with immediate federal shackles. Arthur Vance stood beside him, revealing he had been a federal informant for weeks, providing the digital breadcrumbs needed to freeze the offshore accounts Leone had so arrogantly bragged about. Does this mean she won't have a penny left for an appeal? I asked, feeling a calculated satisfaction wash over me. Miller simply nodded, noting that they were not there for the murder, but for the paper trail that allowed it. The energy company was about to be dismantled piece by crooked piece. A month later, I returned for the final reckoning. The courtroom was packed for the sentencing phase, the air thick with the smell of old paper and heavy wood. Breyer and Beckett sat on either side of me, a fractured but unified front against the darkness. Before I hear the judge decide their permanent fate, I want to know if you're still watching this unfold with me. Comment justice or mercy and add a short reason why, so I can see how you're reading this final chapter. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to convey the core message. If this crosses your comfort line, you're free to exit now. Nurse Miller was sentenced first. She received 15 years for elder abuse and conspiracy, her professional license permanently revoked. She tried to apologize, her voice a pathetic whimper, but I refused to look at her, focusing instead on the deep grain of the oak bench. You violated the most sacred trust a caregiver has, the judge declared, her words cutting through the sterile silence. Thud. The judge's gavel fell for the last time, a period, at the end of a very long, dark sentence. She saved her harshest words for Silas and Leone, citing the premeditated and cannibalistic nature of their betrayal. She sentenced both to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Silas had to be physically carried from the room, his spirit completely broken, and his keening wails echoing through the gallery. Leone was led out in transport chains, the metallic jangle marking her rhythm as she avoided my gaze. As Silas was dragged past, a final realization struck me like a physical blow. The second package of poison hadn't been a backup for him to use. Leone had planted it to kill Silas too, intending to remove the last witness to her greed. He had been a victim in her eyes all along, a tool to be discarded once the harvest was in. Justice isn't a warm blanket. It's a cold, hard floor that you finally stop falling through. I walked out of the courtroom, the cold wind of the parking lot tasting like a promise of peace. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Alaric. The feds found the physical assets. You need to come to the office. The end was not a closing door, but an opening of the earth. The shovel sliced through the damp, dark earth with a rhythmic thud, a sound that felt less like digging a hole and more like preparing a foundation for the century ahead. Under a clear morning sky, I watched as Breyer and Beckett worked together to position the first hazelnut sapling. The cool, metallic touch of the shovel handle was a grounding weight against the warmth of the sun on my neck. The tension of the trial had been replaced by a quiet, focused cooperation, as if the physical act of planting was finally healing the rot Silas left behind. I realized that the 150 legacy trees we planned aren't just a crop. They are a living barrier against the corporate interests that tried to swallow the valley. I discovered that Jessica had set a digital dead man switch on the e-reader that would have sent all the files to the FBI automatically if the device hadn't been accessed by a specific date. She had planned for every failure, including my own potential silence. Steady Beck Breyer said, her voice soft but firm. Keep the roots spread wide. Mom always said they need to breathe. Beckett nodded, his eyes clearer than I had seen them in a decade. I've got it, he replied. This one is for the north corner. It will be the tallest of the lot. As the first tree was secured, we took a moment to breathe in the scent of rich, damp humus and budding hazelnut trees. Breyer discussed her plans for the new clinic, while Beckett mentioned his progress in his stewardship program. The orchard was no longer a crime scene. It was a cathedral of wood and light, where the only judgment was the coming of the rain. The conservancy papers were finalized yesterday, Dad Breyer said, wiping a smudge of dirt from her forehead. No one will ever drill here. Good, I replied, leaning on my spade. Let the only things coming out of this ground be hazelnuts and memories. The rhythmic sound of the wind in the orchard clearing felt like the land itself was sighing in relief. I returned to the house to fetch water for the kids, but I found myself drawn to the e-reader sitting on the porch table. The blue glow of the screen caught my eye in the shade as I went to check a planting diagram. Chime. The digital notification sounded like a bell ringing from the bottom of a well. It was a hidden file programmed to unlock only after the official conclusion date of the trial. The title was simply For Thane, the final note. My hand trembled as I touched the glass, realizing that Jessica had one last thing to say that wasn't about the crime or the vultures. I thought the recordings were done. I thought I knew all your secrets, Jess. The final file revealed that she knew about my own secret health struggle, the heart condition I had hidden from her to spare her worry, and she had been recording messages specifically to guide me through my own recovery after she was gone. I pressed play, and as Jessica's voice filled the porch, her tone wasn't sharp with accusation or heavy with grief. It was as light as the wind in the trees, and she said the one thing I never expected to hear. The first word out of her mouth wasn't my name, but a promise she'd made 40 years ago. Jessica's voice didn't ask for justice. She asked me to remember that even the most scarred land can yield a sweet harvest if you're patient enough to let the rot burn away. As I sat on the porch, the recording revealed a digital trust Jessica had been building for years, hidden behind layers of code that Silas could never touch, specifically designed to fund Beckett's recovery and long-term care. It was the final move in her game, protecting the pawn she knew was most vulnerable. A year has passed since that morning on the porch, and the Garrison farm is thriving under its new conservancy status. It is autumn in Oregon, a season of golden, long-shadowed light, and the intoxicating smell of roasted hazelnuts. I stand in the main orchard, with Beckett watching the steady mechanical hum of the harvest equipment as it moves between the rows. Beckett is sober and steady-handed now, his movements purposeful as he oversees the largest harvest in our family's history. These trees are heavy with nuts that Silas once dismissed as worthless dirt. Look at the weight on these branches, Dad Beckett says, a grin breaking across his weathered face. Mom was right about the new graft. She usually was, Beck, I reply, leaning against the rough bark of a sturdy oak. It just took the rest of us a while to catch up. The rhythmic thrum of the harvester replaces the high-tension silence that once haunted these groves, signaling a return to the natural order of the valley. Whoosh! The fire caught the first envelope, a flash of orange that tasted like freedom. I returned to the house later that afternoon to find a stack of unopened envelopes from the Oregon State Penitentiary, all from Silas. For a year, he has sent a weekly barrage of apologies, justifications, and desperate requests for money to fund a new legal appeal. I carry them to the backyard, the weight of the paper feeling like a burden I am no longer required to carry for a son who still refuses to take true accountability. He's still trying to sell me a version of the truth I've already buried. Some seeds are just too rotten to ever take root again. I drop the stack of letters into a rusted burn barrel, the warmth of the metal comforting against the chilly evening air. I watch the flames lick at the desperate, familiar handwriting. The smoke was a thin gray ghost dancing over the orchard, the only spirit left that didn't belong to the land. I stand there until only white ash remains, feeling the last of the vulture's grip release my heart. The crisp, papery sound of the burning letters is the only eulogy Silas deserves. Rest in peace, Jessica, I whisper as the sun dips below the horizon. The house is quiet now. Let the wind take the rest. I caught a glimpse of the last letter in the pile before it turned to carbon. Silas had started a consulting business inside the prison, proving that the wolf within him hasn't changed at all. I turned away from the embers, but as I reached the porch, I saw a familiar silhouette standing by the front gate. Not a predator this time, but a visitor I had waited a lifetime to welcome properly. The gate creaked, a sound I had once feared when it heralded the arrival of predators, but now it sounded like a greeting from an old friend. I didn't need to check the security feed anymore. I knew the slow and steady arrival of Alaric Benedict's heavy sedan. It brought the weight of the law to my land one last time, but this time, it was for the right reasons. As the car came to a halt, Alaric stepped out, but he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a woman from the state archives. They had come to officially record Jessica's hybrid tree as a historical agricultural landmark, ensuring her brilliance was etched into the state's heritage. We walked together toward the center of the newly protected 50 acres, the gold-tinted light of an Oregon autumn filtering through the leaves. At the boundary of the conservancy, we gathered around a granite boulder. Beckett and Breyer helped me pull back the canvas to unveil a modest bronze plaque. I ran my fingers over the cool, smooth surface, reading the words, "The Jessica Garrison Memorial Conservancy." Alaric read the official charter aloud, his voice steady, as he navigated the legal language that forbade any mineral or gas extraction in perpetuity. "She always wanted the orchard to be a sanctuary," Thane Alaric said, looking out over the rows. "Now it's permanent." The law finally caught up to the land, and the greed that almost claimed this soil has been buried for good. We moved deeper into the heart of the orchard, where the final hole remained. Tree number 150, a hybrid Jessica had spent years perfecting, sat in its burlap wrap. I invited Beckett and Breyer to hold the sapling together, their hands steady as they positioned the future. I took up the shovel, the rhythmic sound of the metal meeting, the damp earth acting as a pulse for the silent valley. As I shoveled the last of the rich soil over the roots, I realized that the truth wasn't just in the recordings or the courtroom transcripts. It was in the resilience of the life we had preserved. By donating this land, I had effectively made the energy company's remaining surrounding leases worthless. Their multi-million-dollar gamble had collapsed because one old man refused to move, dealing a final blow to the vultures from beyond Jessica's grave. The truth is a slow-growing thing like a hazelnut tree. It takes years to root, but once it does, no storm can shake it. "This is the last one," Dad Breyer whispered, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of honey and violet. "The circle is closed." "It's not an end," Beck, I said, looking at my youngest son. "It's the first day of the rest of the forest." The peaceful silence of a valley without secrets settled over us, smelling of crushed hazelnut leaves and cold granite. I walked back to the porch alone, picking up the e-reader one last time. I watched the screen flicker as the battery hit its final percentage. It displayed the last image Jessica ever took, a photo of me from behind, looking toward the horizon with a simple caption, "I knew you'd find me, Thane." I let the battery die, the screen fading to black as the first star appeared. I looked up and saw a flash of a white dress moving between the rows of trees, not a ghost of a victim, but a guardian of the land. The end. When I look back on everything that happened, I realize this was never just a victory over criminals. It was a mirror showing me where I had been blind. For years, I believed that love and hard work alone could protect a family. But this family story taught me that silence can be dangerous. When we ignore warning signs simply because they come from someone we love, we give betrayal a place to grow. Some people online might call what I did a dad revenge, but the truth is more complicated. My dad revenge was never about hatred. It was about refusing to let greed erase the life my wife built beside me. This family story forced me to confront a painful truth. Being a father does not mean closing your eyes when your children walk into darkness. Sometimes love means standing up to them. If there is one lesson I want to leave behind, it is this: do not make the mistake I almost made. Pay attention to the small changes, the quiet lies, and the moments when something in your heart tells you the truth is wrong. A family story can either become a legacy of trust or a warning about what happens when truth is ignored. And what some people call dad revenge is sometimes simply a man choosing justice over fear. In my darkest moment, I remembered something my wife once told me: God does not promise a life without storms, but He gives us the strength to walk through them without losing our soul. That reminder kept me standing when everything else collapsed. And if my dad revenge means anything at all, it means protecting the truth so the next generation can grow in better soil. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. I'd truly like to hear your perspective. What would you do if you faced a situation like Thane's dilemma? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories of resilience and difficult choices. A gentle note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-life themes and social conflicts, certain details were dramatized to enhance the storytelling experience. If this type of content isn't your preference, feel free to explore other videos on the channel that may suit you better.
오늘 평일 아니요? 애기 옷 개 예쁘다. 근데 강군 오빠한테 안 가는 게 좋겠어. 왜냐면 주년인데 자기 혼자 썰방 해야지. 만약에 수장님이었으면 가서 이제 좀 축하해주고 잠깐 와도 되는데, 이제 뭘 외로우고요. 그거 언니 생각이지.